Everybody for showing up. Hopefully you enjoyed the eclipse last week. So today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Karl Hausker, who is a senior fellow at the World Resource Institute Climate Program. He leads modeling and analysis of pathways to net zero carbon emissions. His career has spanned 3 decades in the fields of climate change, energy, and the environment, and he has worked in the legislative and executive branches, research institutes, NGOs, and consulting. He served President Clinton as a deputy assistant administrator in the EPA's policy office and was a chief economist for the US Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. Dr. Hausker got his bachelor's from Cornell in 1979 in economics and also went on to earn an MS and PhD in public policy from the University of California, Berkeley. And so without further ado, Dr. Hausker.
Thanks, Vivek. Great to have a chance to be with you all today on a subject I've been laboring on for a few years, climate change. Also just want to say a word about the World Resources Institute. It's headquartered in Washington, but it is probably one of the world's, if not the world's, largest research institute devoted to issues of sustainability. We work on climate, energy, oceans, forests, food, water, cities. We have offices in all of the major developing countries: China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, and with project offices in Africa as well. So as you move through your undergraduate studies, perhaps onto your graduate studies, and are looking for a place to make a difference on sustainability issues, I hope you'll consider WRI. We're always looking for the best and the brightest. So my talk today is on zero carbon electricity, which I consider a key to the clean energy transition, meaning a key to solving the problem of climate change. So today I'm going to talk quickly about the nature of the climate change problem, which I understand you already have some background in, and zero in on the key role of electricity. Then I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on the economics of renewable sources of electricity and talk about the myths on that topic and the reality. Then I'm going to talk about the key to economics, which is really looking at system costs and the integration costs that come with operating a power grid, and wind up with some reflections on the pathways we need to get on to get to net zero emissions and to stop the further warming of this planet. If we have a little time, we might do an optional deep dive on carbon capture. And I'd also like to say that what I'm going to give you is very much mainstream analytic views and facts. I'll note some dissenting views, and I'll try to highlight where I'm really giving you my opinion and take all that into account. You'll have the PDF of this deck. I have web links throughout, which you may want to do a deeper dive on yourself. You may also want to pull up on the web a lecture I did here in the fall of 2022, just after the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which talks more broadly about US policy and how important the Inflation Reduction Act is in finally getting this country moving toward solving the problem both at the national level and international level. But before I dive into that, I can't help mentioning one of my favorite books called The Wizard and the Prophet by Charles Mann. And there's a link here to a book review of this. It talks about the career of Norman Borlaug, an agronomist who was really considered the father of the Green Revolution, and also a man named William Vogt, who is an ecologist, and in the 60s was sort of responsible for coining the term carrying capacity. And as this quote here says, wizards believe that science and technology properly applied can get us to produce our way out of our dilemmas. Prophets, on the other hand, believe that there are natural limits and we transgress these limits at our peril. Perhaps in all of us, there's a bit of a wizard and a prophet. This lecture is going to be mostly from the perspective of the wizard. Gandalf is one of my favorite wizards, if that reference rings true to you. But it's really, I'm going to be talking about what we need to do in the electricity sector to help solve climate. Now, there's a whole other view on climate change on how we need to change lifestyles and values and reduce our footprint on Earth in general. That's another valid perspective, but just I urge you, totally aside from climate change, to indulge a little bit in your own reflections on wizards versus prophets. Just to set the stage, as I'm sure you know, climate change is truly a multi-gas problem. Carbon dioxide, of course, is the biggest gas we are emitting that is contributing to global warming, both direct emissions in the blue as well as shaded in the green here, the kind of carbon dioxide emissions that come from forestry and land use change, the clearing and burning of forests. There's also a big chunk related to methane emissions and a significant chunk associated with nitrous oxide emissions, and then a tiny sliver of something called the F gases. I'm going to be focusing on carbon dioxide emissions, and particularly from the electricity sector. This is not the whole problem, it's a big chunk of the problem. Climate change is also a multi-sector problem. We need to solve it by looking at our activities across all sectors: electricity, ag and forest, what we're doing in buildings, transportation, industry, and how we mine and produce energy from the land. And what I'm going to zero in later in a moment on how electricity can really hold the key to addressing most of the sectors. Finally, I want to emphasize that climate change is a multi-country problem. It is an international, global problem that requires, of course, international cooperation. It is probably the gnarliest, most difficult environmental challenge that humankind has ever faced. It has to be dealt with at an international level through climate treaties, climate negotiations. Nations have roles to play. States and provinces have roles to play. Local governments have roles to play. Business, NGOs, civil society. And it's also particularly gnarly because it's a long-term problem that we can't fix overnight, but we need to get going on it. What this graph suggests when we look at the total emissions of the globe broken down by some major countries is, I want you to be aware that even if we suddenly waved a magic wand and eliminated the emissions from the United States, or from the 27 countries in the European Union, or from an advanced economy like Japan or Canada, or eliminated all of those, we still have a problem. So we have to work on this as a globe, each nation doing its share. Let me go back to the sector chart. Why is electricity, why do I argue that it's really the key to limiting climate change? We need to take that blue chunk of electricity and we need to transition it to zero or low carbon emission sources. If we do that, that takes care of about 25% of the problem. There's lots of different ways to do this. We have solar, photovoltaics, we have wind power, we have bioenergy, we have hydropower from our dams. We have geothermal ways to produce electricity. We have nuclear power, and we can also use fossil fuels like coal and gas to continue to create electricity, but we need to capture the carbon and store it underground safely. So we have a lot of options, and the key to solving this big chunk of carbon dioxide emissions is that we can also substitute electricity for the burning of fossil fuels in these other sectors. So in buildings, in the green wedge, we can stop burning gas and fuel oil to heat our buildings, and to cook our food, we can use electric heat pumps, electric stoves, electric water heaters. That's that substitution of electricity for the combustion of fossil fuels. In transportation, you are living through the revolution in electric vehicles. They are really taking off. And we can substitute electricity for the burning of gasoline and diesel in vehicles, in trains. We can even imagine short hop airplane flights with special planes built using lithium batteries. And finally, in industry, the purple wedge of the chart, there are all sorts of low and medium temperature heat applications for which we can use electricity instead of burning gas or oil or coal. Through electric resistance heating, through electric heat pumps, we can supply much of the needs of industry. Not only that, we can use electricity to produce hydrogen through electrolysis, literally splitting water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. Once we do that, we can use that hydrogen for high temperature heat applications in industry and other uses where we can't directly use electricity. We can also use that hydrogen to produce ammonia, a portable, valuable liquid fuel. Perhaps 30 years from now, we'll be running maritime shipping on freighters that are burning ammonia instead of burning dirty bunker fuel oil. So this is why electricity that looks like just one blue wedge there can help on so many other wedges in reducing emissions. I'm going to turn now to how this might play out. Like right now, there's, as a globe, we directly use electricity for about 20% of our end uses, the various things we use electricity for. If we do all the things I just said across buildings, transportation, and industry, the direct use of electricity could jump to 60% or even 70% of our total energy use. And what this graph shows is a modeled scenario of how that might work, how we might get to net zero emissions by 2050 and stop warming the globe. This is a study by the International Renewable Energy Agency that its model would limit us to about 1.5 degrees warming. And what you see on the vertical graph here is total global electricity generation in terawatt hours. Currently, at around 30,000 terawatt hours. If we successfully electrify lots of end uses, as I described, we would need to triple electricity generation to about 90,000 terawatt hours by 2050. That's a big task, but it's doable. And we can deploy all those low carbon or zero carbon ways to get there. In this scenario, you see wind in blue, solar and PV growing to about providing 70% of the total world generation. Those are sometimes called variable sources because they're weather dependent. The sun comes and goes, the wind comes and blows. In this scenario, the modelers said that clean, firm sources of electricity would provide the other 30%. Hydropower in dark blue, some bioenergy in green, some nuclear in whatever that color is, and also some carbon capture on fossil fuels. So this is a typical kind of scenario in which we bring together a suite of electricity generating technologies to wring out all the carbon from the electricity sector and at the same time triple its production. Let's just linger a little bit on all these options, some of which you probably have heard of, some of which may be relatively new. We have lots of options, but they're all at a different scale of readiness and at a different level of scalability. Like how could these really be part of tripling global supplies? At the top, there's one called ocean tidal wave generation, very much at the R&D stage and probably not going to play a big role over the next 30 years, but maybe. The second one has gotten a lot of attention lately. It's advanced geothermal. Up until now, in places like California and Indonesia, we have tapped into geothermal resources, hot water, hot steam, fairly close to the surface, and been able to hook it up to a turbine, spin the turbine, and make electricity. But now we've developed more advanced drilling techniques where we can go deeper, and we can also do horizontal drilling, and we can create new geothermal resources at greater depths in the earth. This is being at the demonstration scale now. It is moving toward commercialization, and it may be quite scalable to where we could do this in many parts of the world, not just the limited geographies that we see now. Then we have two types of wind, onshore and offshore. both fully commercialized and fully scalable. We can build wind in lots of different places. CSP is concentrated solar power. That's where you put mirrors in a very sunny place like a desert, focus the mirrors on a central spot to create the heat that, again, boils water, spins turbines, creates electricity. This is being demonstrated in a few places, but it's quite limited by physical geography. We just don't have that many desert areas where this is going to work. Solar PV, again, fully commercialized, scalable. We can put it on rooftops, we can put it on farmland, we can put it in deserts, and that's taking off very strongly, as you know. Bioenergy, the growing of crops dedicated to then combusting them and burning them, spinning a turbine, making electricity. This is a zero carbon source because on net, if you grow a crop, you pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, you burn it, goes back up, net zero effect. It's fully commercialized, but limited because of like this, how much land can we devote to growing crops for energy? We also need to grow crops for 8 billion people, and we have biodiversity concerns too about consuming and using new land. So there's some sustainability concerns. Hydro power, there's dams all over the world, it's fully commercialized, but it's limited by physical geography. There's just so many places you can build dams. And as a globe, we've exhausted most of them. Maybe we can build a few more, but that's really not scalable either. Nuclear power, fully commercialized, scalable, you can build them most places. And we also have advanced designs that are at the research and development stage or at the demonstration stage that are also very promising. But as I'm sure you know, there are concerns over safety, the operational safety of nuclear reactors, the disposal of the waste, and also risks of weapons proliferation. So for all those reasons, some people have deep concerns about nuclear. And then we have our 3 remaining fossil fuels here. Oil is really not used for power generation, but both gas and coal, as I said earlier, could be fitted with carbon capture to reduce or nearly eliminate the emissions and compress that CO2 and store it in safe geologic formations. So we have a lot of options, some of them ready, some of them very scalable to help with that tripling of power generation that we need to do. As you can imagine, there's very conflicting views over some of these options, and I particularly want to highlight nuclear and carbon capture. Some people like to exclude them from the list of power options. Some of them want to include them. Regarding nuclear power, the people who would like to exclude nuclear as an option for power generation says the risks are unacceptable. Proliferation, operation, waste disposal, but also the cost is just too high and will never come down. Those who would include it on the list to build out clean electricity says the risks are real, but they're manageable, particularly in comparison to the risks that climate change pose. They would argue that the costs will come down, particularly in the US and Europe and elsewhere, because there are countries that successfully build reactors at a reasonable cost, like South Korea and China. Then others look at carbon capture, and some people want to exclude it. No, carbon capture should not be on the list of acceptable power sources. They would argue that the risks of carbon capture are unknown. They're too high. Will the CO2 really stay down there? Are we really going to transport a lot of carbon dioxide from sites to injection sites underground? What about the pipelines, et cetera? And they say the cost is too high, the cost will never come down. And interestingly, they make an argument that people label moral hazard. Say, if we develop this carbon capture technology, aren't we just going to keep burning fossil fuels? And that's bad. It's sort of like if you buy car insurance, does that make you drive less safe because I figure I got insurance to cover the car and cover my injuries? I don't buy into that moral hazard argument myself, but some people make it. The people who would include carbon capture on the list of acceptable power generation opportunities say the risks are knowable. Maybe we'll do some more research, some more experience. They're pretty minimal. The cost will come down. And very importantly, they argue that carbon capture and storage is really essential to meet our net zero targets. Not just in the power sector where it could come in quite handy, but also in other areas of industry or for the task of technological carbon dioxide removal. What do I mean by that? In industry, there are some emissions that don't come from actually burning fossil fuels, but are emitted through chemical processes, like in the making of cement. We don't really know how to eliminate the CO2 from cement processing except by capturing the emissions. Maybe we'll get smart and invent something else, or maybe we'll stop using cement, but probably not in the next 30 years. Similarly, at some point, I'm sorry to say, we are probably going to have to remove some major amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We may very well overshoot a acceptable temperature of 1.5 or 2 or 2.5 degrees, and we'll want to literally kind of reverse the global warming process. Maybe we'll be doing this when you're sitting on a rocking chair in a senior home somewhere late in the century, not sure. But we need methods to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Tree planting is good, but also technological means. And carbon capture combined with direct air processing, what they call direct air capture and storage, is one way to do that. So the common view among those who would exclude nuclear and carbon capture goes something like this. They're too risky, too costly, and we don't need them because we can double or triple electricity production and be dependent on grids that are solar and wind dominant, maybe 90% or more. And some other renewables can provide the rest of the needed electricity, aided by storage and load shifting, and still maintain those reliable grids that we all like. And one interesting part of the argument that I'm going to spend some time on is the argument that solar and wind are now the cheapest source of electricity. And if they're cheapest, why would you want to build anything else? So I want to do a deep dive on those kind of arguments. But let me just pause for a second. I'm not going to talk at you for a full 50 minutes. Any questions on what I've put up on the board so far? And by the way, there are no dumb questions in this area. This is all complex stuff. Did we have a question over here?
Thanks. Thank you. When you say industry, like what exactly does that encapsulate? I just wasn't really sure.
Industry in like the pie wedge of emissions is very broadly defined. It's sort of all manufacturing. It is everything from making automobiles to food processing to beer making to just everything outside of sort of this commercial offices. Like all your commercial offices and residences are lumped into the building sector. Just about anything we make goes into the industry category. Anything we grow in terms of food is in agriculture, if that's helpful. It's a big category.
Hello.
Yes.
Can you just quickly explain how carbon capture works?
Sure.
Yeah.
Carbon capture involves taking the exhaust stream from a smokestack and running it through actually like a little mini chemical factory where the CO2 molecules are stripped out of the exhaust stream. That CO2 is then compressed and piped to an injection site and then injected deep into a secure geologic formation. That's what people think of most commonly as that's stripping out. There is another technology called oxycombustion where you could, where you take an air separator at the front end of a combustor, separate it into the nitrogen and the oxygen, and then burn the fuel in a pure stream of oxygen. What comes out the other end is pure CO2, ready for compression, ready for injection.
Just in your opinion, to at least in the States, to make it work on entire electricity, would we have to see major lifestyle changes across the country, or could we transition to mostly electric use with the current like status quo of just like general life?
Are you asking this as a wizard or a prophet?
I'm asking your opinion.
Let me put my wizard hat on and say most of the modeling that I'm walking through and that's done across the globe assumes no big lifestyle changes. There are, we can talk later, maybe in Q&A, about the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which gathers hundreds of models from researchers across the globe to look at how we might solve this problem. And many of those models do incorporate things like more compact cities that require less transportation by vehicles. Some of them assume that there will be some shift from very meat-intensive diets to more plant-based diets. And that can be sort of folded into a model. However, there are very few people who run a model and say they're going to be, we need massive lifestyle changes to make this happen.
So I had two questions. One of them was on nuclear power plants in general. And I guess it's this one that's making the feedback. So one of my questions is that I know that nuclear power plants can have some sort of an effect on temperature pollution in nearby water sources, and then the water that is used to cool the plants themselves to make sure they don't combust. Is the trade-off for freshwater health worth it in that sense to rely on that form instead of on a different form?
Yeah, good question. Almost any power plant that is relying on heat to boil water, to spin a turbine, will have an issue of waste heat. And so both coal plants and nuclear plants often have that iconic sort of curve-shaped tower, and you see lots of stuff coming out. It's just steam. So it's not pollution per se. If it is cooled by ocean water or river water, there will be a thermal impact, which could have some negative environmental impacts, depending on, again, the intensity and stuff like that. Other sources, like wind does not have a waste heat problem, solar does not have a waste heat problem, geothermal does not have a waste heat problem. So yeah, it's also fair to say almost any of these power generation technologies will at least have some impact on the environment, and we need to carefully weigh those and carefully reduce them as much as possible. Maybe one more?
All right, so would you say that part of the reason for nuclear energy's costs might be the fact that people are hesitant to have them on a mass scale? Because I can think of a country like France, nuclear energy is definitely a lot cheaper there. And also, France is just less politically opposed to using nuclear energy as a major source of energy.
The differences in cost across different countries, I would say, is not so much it's indirectly linked to public opinion. That is to say, if the public is supportive and the government policy is supportive, that country will tend to build many nuclear plants. When you build many, you achieve learning, you achieve economies of scale, you maintain a skilled workforce to build more as well as to maintain your existing plants. If you're only building one every 10 or 20 years, you're almost starting from scratch, and you don't have a standard design to work from. So yes, it's indirectly related to public opinion and acceptability through various mechanisms. Okay, well, let's move on. Great questions. Before we do the deep dive, I just want to emphasize how important it is to maintain reliable electricity. The electric grids of this country, other countries, are often described as the world's largest machines. They're literally power plants linked by transmission lines, linked to transformers, linked to spidery webs of distribution lines going all the way to your dorm or apartment. And they are geographically the most sprawling large machines we have. They're also delicate in the sense of There is no other product or service we buy where the supply and demand have to be balanced literally minute by minute. And if we don't do that, the system crashes and you have blackouts. Never take this for granted. And particularly now, we have the extra challenge of demand, particularly in the US, is growing like crazy because of the growth of artificial intelligence. The data centers and computing centers are now moving us from sort of flat electricity consumption to growing electricity demand even before we do all that electrification of end uses that I was talking about. Second, climate change is making it harder to keep the lights on. When we experience severe weather patterns, sometimes that results in drought. The reservoirs of our hydro dams are not filled anymore. We've seen this in the US. We've seen this in India. We've seen this in China. Also, more severe weather can spike air conditioning needs on a hot day above where they've ever been before. They can also, global climate change can also result in cold spells. When the jet stream becomes really wavy and dips down way into Texas for a long time like it did in 2021. 10 million people without power as the system crashed, over 200 deaths. It's really important to maintain reliability as we move to decarbonize and grow this key sector. So let me go back to the arguments on why we don't need nuclear, we don't need carbon capture, we can lean very heavily on these renewable sources. What is the cheapest source of electricity? Okay, I have to answer the question. You will see many figures like the one I present here in studies and in the media. What is this? On the vertical axis, we have dollars per megawatt hour, the cost of electricity, and we have a look back to 2016. And what we see by this measure of dollars per megawatt hour is solar in yellow and wind costs plummeting over the last decade and will probably continue to decrease somewhat into the future with economies of scale and wider dispersion. Well, we see the cost of coal in the black line jigging around a little bit, certainly way above, $50 a megawatt hour, maybe flattening out in the future, and the cost of producing electricity from natural gas, sometimes called fossil gas, increasing here and particularly spiking with the Ukraine invasion. This chart shows the amazing decline in solar and wind costs that have occurred over the last 10 years. And it doesn't even show nuclear because nuclear is way up here above $100 a megawatt hour. These is for new construction capital and operating costs. This is all good news, but there is a catch. But I first just want to say that when we ask that question, what's cheapest? We have some of the world's experts saying that renewables are the cheapest source of electricity. The head of the International Renewable Energy Agency says it's cheapest. That's the leader of the study that I showed up earlier. The head of the International Energy Agency says onshore wind and solar PV are cheaper today than fossil fuel plants almost everywhere. Cheap and often cheaper to even operate existing things. But there is a catch. And asking you what is the cheapest source of electricity is kind of a trick question, I apologize, because it all depends. There is no simple answer to that. Every grid is different and the state of that grid is gonna affect what is the cheapest thing to do next. Sadly, in my mind, and I wanna emphasize this as an opinion, that I believe that sort of a myth has been constructed around the idea that renewables are cheapest. It's easy to say that, and then just say, end of story, let's build renewables because they're cheapest. But the truth, as is so common, is more complicated. And to start out that discussion, I put a little red circle around here. What is this measure of cost? It's something called the levelized cost of energy, or LCOE. And the myth of renewables just being cheapest across the board rests on the use of this one measure. Pet peeve of mine, it's really the levelized cost of electricity. Energy is a much broader umbrella term, so let's call it what it is, electricity. All credible experts, and here I'm moving from opinion to fact, all credible experts who you might talk to and say, what is LCOE? Is it a good way to compare costs across different technologies and plan a power system? They would say, no, this measure is simplistic and it risks comparing apples to oranges. What is LCOE? As I said, it's a measure of the average cost of electricity, but importantly, from a standalone plant, just sitting there by itself, not connected to a grid at all, but just you measure, oh, sun is up, electricity comes out, sun is down, no electricity, but let's average the cost over the whole year. Natural gas plant, you turn it on, you turn it off, you ramp it up, you ramp it down, average the cost over the whole year, just sitting there unconnected to a grid. It's a little more complicated in the sense of you do some present value calculations because you're looking at costs over time. But the idea that I just want to plant in you, average cost, standalone plant, not connected to a grid. Now, what has happened to LCOE over time? Just as I saw as in that first graph I showed you, I want to just show you even a little more detail by one of the most famous estimates of LCOE, a company called Lazard that puts out a study every year. And on the left here, we see the LCOE of wind plants, and this is US. Since 2009, the cost of wind plants measured by this LCOE measure has decreased by 66%. That's great news. The LCOE of solar photovoltaic plants in the US over that same period, 2009 to 2023, decreased by 84%. This is great news. This means that we have these building blocks, these plants that can produce electricity at low cost in a climate-friendly way. But do they mean that we should build the entire grid out of renewable sources like this? My answer is no, it's more complicated than that. Should we just build generating plants with the lowest LCOE? Is that all that matters? Well, sorry, got to make a basketball analogy. You can probably guess why. That was my sport. If your top scorer is your shooting guard, 30 points a game, bunch of rebounds, bunch of assists, would you build a winning team by just recruiting 4 more shooting guards? Got any basketball fans here? I think you get my point. The levelized cost of energy, the average cost of a megawatt hour from a standalone power plant, if you just focus on that, that's like just focusing on the stats of your shooting guard. What you want to do instead is look at system cost. The average cost of an electricity system, including all the plants linked together with transmission distribution, all the technologies needed to maintain a reliable grid. If you're a basketball coach, that's the equivalent of looking at your winning team composition, making sure they integrate their play and play as a team. So integration of electricity grid is important. Getting those power plants to play together is important, and balancing that supply and demand minute by minute. In the old days, grid operators could turn on all power plants. They turn them on, turn them off, turn them up, turn them down. Output was firm, controllable, dispatchable. That integration was fairly easy by today's standards, where we now have a lot of solar and wind coming on. It's cheap, but it's weather dependent. It is intermittent. It is variable in ways that you don't control. So how do we integrate that? Let me give some examples of this variability, the challenge of grid operators in pulling this together. This is an example from Australia. It's rather fresh. It goes up right until Sunday, April 14th. Pulled this down rather recently. Australia has a lot of solar and a lot of wind. And this shows the time pattern of production over the last week. Australia's solar production peaks at a little over 15,000 megawatts. Great production, middle of the day. But I know this is kind of an obvious point, but remember, solar disappears completely for 12 hours a day. Done. finish, nada. And it jumps right back up the next day. And in a nice sunny place like Australia, it's actually pretty consistent at peaking out at about 15,000 megawatts each day. Wind is kind of funny. Australia doesn't have as much wind down here shown in green, but you can see it's a very kind of just stochastic, random pattern, comes and goes, seems to be generally stronger during the nighttime hours, during the day. But if you're a grid manager, you need to manage this random nature across daily variation. And of course, I forget what their average load is, but these big blank spaces here, Australia is turning on the coal and turning on the natural gas to fill those gaps. So that's daily variation that you, if you ever become a grid operator, have to deal with. There is also seasonal variation in solar and wind. And this graph, again from Australia, shows 52 weeks of average weekly production of solar. It's not constant across weeks. Those averages per week vary a lot. Why? Here we are in June, that's winter down in Australia. You're averaging in your deepest winter months only about 400 megawatts, 400 gigawatt hours per week. Move up into the summer, November, December, you're more than twice that, up at about 1,000 gigawatt hours a week. So how do you size your system? How much solar do you want when you get a lot more? Of course, in the summer, the sun is closer, the angle is better. In the winter, the sun's farther away, the angle is worse. How do you cope with that variation? With wind, again, it's even more random than solar. Here we have 52 weeks of average wind generation in Australia. And you get, seems more generally in the winter months, less in the summer months. But any given week, it's hard to predict exactly where you're going to be. And you will have to fill those gaps with something else, some kind of integration strategy. Yeah, quick clarifying question?
What are the negatives, the past three graphs?
Mhm.
How do you explain that?
Yeah, I'm fairly sure that, but I need to double check that this is curtailment. In the most abundant parts of the middle of the day, you are generating so much solar and so much wind that you have to spill some of it. You can't use all of it. Ideally, you would have a battery to soak up that extra power, or maybe you'd make hydrogen with it. Right now, commonly across the world where you've had a lot of solar and wind built, you sometimes just have to spill it. And in case that question wasn't heard by all, the gentleman was asking, why does the graph go below zero into negative territory on a couple places here? And then, so we talked about daily fluctuation, we talked about seasonal fluctuation, and then we need to talk about random weather variation. And this brings me to my favorite German word, Dunkelflaute. This is when solar and wind generation drop to very low levels, just randomly. Very cloudy set of days, weather conditions where the wind dies. And this is just one example from 2017, where they had a Dunkelflaute of blue and yellow solar and wind generation that was very low. Your system needs a way to cope with this. In the US, we don't invent really long words like Dunkelflaute. Instead, we call it a solar and wind drought. Not near as much fun. As a grid operator, you have to deal with random weather fluctuation. So how do we deal with that? What are the integration options? First, you can build more transmission, aggregating your solar and wind over a bigger geographic area. The more you aggregate, the less variation there is on the system. You can also build storage. We are currently building a lot of lithium batteries that last 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours. We are developing more advanced batteries using iron, zinc, and other materials that can last maybe up to 100 hours. And there's also something called pumped hydro, where you pump the water uphill, store it in a reservoir, and then let it run back down turbine. We've used most of the good areas for that. We can maybe expand that some more. But this is a way of storing your electricity, then using it when the renewable output decreases. Another way to integrate, to keep the lights on, keep supplies reliable, goes by the name of demand response. Sometimes it's called demand management or load shifting. That's where you move the load, move your demand to when the renewable energy is abundant. We can do this in several ways. Like, you got an electric car, you want to plug it in. Maybe you want to plug it in the middle of the day when you have that really abundant solar energy as opposed to charging at night. Maybe you could give your utility the ability to operate your water heater. So you could just have your electric water heater running at times when wind or solar is abundant. That's the kind of thing we can do. Another integration strategy is just over-generation. If you need a lot of solar in the winter, but you don't get much, you might just have to build so much solar capacity that you have more than enough in the summer. Hopefully you can put that to good work, again, by storing it or by making hydrogen or something, but this is a strategy too. Finally, the way to integrate is to complement that solar and wind with clean, firm generation. Generation you can turn on and off, ramp up, ramp down in response to the variation in the solar and wind generation. Funny thing is, that LCOE calculation, as I said, it's standalone. It's a power plant sitting all by itself. So it doesn't include any integration costs. If you just throw a 4-hour battery onto the LCOE of a solar plant, you can have that LCOE double, just like that. Throw an 8-hour battery on, still doesn't get you through the whole night. Again, the LCOE goes way up. I just want to really emphasize, everything I'm saying doesn't mean that in some way I'm anti-solar or anti-wind or anti-renewables. I want to go back to that slide. I said, we have had a tremendous decrease in the cost of solar and wind over the last 10 years. And that is great news because we can now use solar and wind as a building block for zero carbon grids. But it doesn't mean that we don't need to complement them with other sources. Here's just an example from New York State. New York State is aiming to have a zero-emission electricity grid by 2040. And New York State is expecting its own Dunkelflaute every once in a while. So in the language of this scoping plan, they said, we're going to have multi-day periods of very low renewable output. So we've identified a need for 18 to 23 gigawatts of firm zero carbon capacity to add to our existing hydro and nuclear. So here's their generation needs from now out to 2050. Here's a lot of solar in yellow, a lot of wind in blue, a lot of batteries in purple, and here's almost 20 gigawatts of zero carbon firm, which in a footnote they say it's probably a hydrogen turbine. We need this turbine standing around in case we need to backfill for solar and wind when we have a Dunkelflaute in New York. If you don't believe me, who is this Hausker guy? I would encourage you to read this report, fairly accessible, not super technical. It's written by 16 authors at the National Renewable Energy Lab. And these are people, of course, who have devoted their lives to advancing renewable technologies. Key quote from it: significant unanswered questions remain regarding moving toward or achieving 100% renewables at a national scale for all hours of the year. There is no simple answer to how far we can increase renewable penetration before costs rise dramatically or reliability becomes compromised. This is an important concept, important enough that I'm going to walk you through another graph. This is from that NREL study, NREL authors study, that on the y-axis is a qualitative degree of difficulty or cost of maintaining the grid. And on the x-axis moves us through 0, 20, 60, 80, up to 100% renewables. And this paper identifies 3 zones, 3 challenges of how do we integrate renewables, keep the lights on at affordable cost. Up until maybe 40-ish%, they refer to that as zone 1. They call it the short-term variability problem, which is largely solved. You can integrate renewables at low cost with dispatchable gas plants, turn them on, turn them off, turn them on, turn them off, and with 4-hour batteries to balance fluctuations here and there. Okay, so far so good. When you go beyond 40, maybe up to 80-ish in round numbers, you enter zone 2, which is called the diurnal mismatch problem. Diurnal means daily, sun up, sun down, predictable pattern. They say this is going to require a lot more storage, probably measured in hours, along with the escalation of other integration steps. The load management, the expanded transmission system's a big way. And they say, we're getting there. This is partially solved. And then zone 3, they describe as the seasonal problem, largely unsolved. As you try to push too high, you get on this exponential part of the curve in terms of difficulty and cost. And so this is probably gonna, if we get there, we require very long-term storage. We'll need ways to address the Dunkelflaute, as well as the seasonal variation. And so again, you don't need to be an electrical engineer to wrap your arms around this concept. There's diminishing returns as you push way out. If you're at 90%, 95% renewables, and you're adding yet another solar plant that just produces during the day, you're probably not adding much value to the system, and you are not improving reliability at that stage. So one more final quote from this NREL study: reducing the cost of low carbon generation in the electric sector, potentially by keeping non-renewable options, including carbon capture and nuclear available, enables electrifying and thus decarbonizing other sectors and reducing economy-wide carbon emissions. This is the idea of keeping a portfolio of technologies, having not just a shooting guard, but a center and a power forward and a point guard and a small forward. This same argument is echoed in the IPCC 6th Assessment Report, Work Group 3. I served as an expert reviewer on that process, made my brain explode. This report is 2,000 pages. But in Chapter 6, in box 6.8, the same kind of cautions I just explained about trying to push all the way to 100% renewables. And just as a final illustration of that, in that same Chapter 6 of the IPCC report, which looked at 500 plus scenarios on how to limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees, they give us some illustrations of what might the generation mix look like in the future as we decarbonize. So each of these figures shows a supply source, solar and wind grouped together, its share of global generation, and how it would change as we move from 2020 to 2050. Currently, solar and wind produce a little under 10% of global generation. The good news with that cheap solar and power, we can grow it immensely to achieve 55, 70, maybe even 80% of total generation. But the IPCC scenarios don't go beyond that. They complement that with firm sources. The second figure is carbon capture and electricity. Again, percent of global generation moving from 2020 to 2050. Right now, we're just doing demonstrations. It's really 0%. It might grow to 5 or 10%, maybe more. A firm source complementing the solar and wind. And finally, nuclear in the global generation mix. Nuclear is currently about 10% of global generation, carbon-free. And over time, it might stay at about 10%, it might grow, 20%, maybe less. But remember, even if it stays at 10%, the IPCC models say we are doubling global generation, at least doubling. So if you stay at 10%, you have to double the absolute amount of nuclear power compared to what we have today. So I've talked a lot about cost, about integration, but I also just want to pose the question, is 100% renewables technically feasible if we put cost aside? And the answer is, yeah, maybe you could do it. Maybe you could run a grid entirely on renewables. There are a couple of academic authors, Jacobson at Stanford, Teskey in Australia, some Finnish modelers that run their model without nuclear as an option, without carbon capture as an option. And typically they have massive expansions of transmission systems, massive amounts of battery storage, and even thermal storage as heat or cold as a way to store the energy produced by electricity. Unprecedented amounts of load shifting, demand management. Somehow they make the models come out that, yeah, we can do this. I'd encourage you to delve into this if you think it is, but is definitely not in the mainstream of modeling conducted by governments and reviewed by the IPCC. And in terms of what governments are actually doing, I want to add a final note on the electricity sector. What are governments really planning on doing? Not just modelers in academia or think tanks or whatever. Well, governments submit something called long-term strategies for 2050 to the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the International Climate Treaty. They lay out their visions on how they can reduce emissions, getting all the way to net zero emissions. Well, my think tank reviewed the first 29 long-term strategies submitted. 18 of those countries indicated they plan to use carbon capture to reduce emissions from their fossil sources. 16 countries indicated they plan to use nuclear generation. Excuse me. But then if you zoom in on the larger economies, 5 of the G7 countries have nuclear in their LTS. US, United Kingdom, France, Japan, Canada. 10 of the 20 G20 countries have nuclear in their long-term strategy. 4 additional countries that haven't submitted yet, I have them under construction. So in the real world, governments are moving ahead with nuclear as an option, and that's important, I think, to keep in mind. So the pathway to net zero emissions, just to sum up, stepping back just purely for electricity, first of all, we need to be very efficient in all of our energy use. We need to try to electrify every use possible and make hydrogen where needed to fill in the gaps. We need to double or triple global electricity generation, gradually convert it to all zero carbon. We can build out wind and solar aggressively. The integration costs are still low right now. Build more transmission, more batteries, et cetera, but complement it. Keep existing nuclear plants running if they're safe. Create new viable options for nuclear, carbon capture, geothermal, those things that complement the variable renewables. Above all, spread your chips. Don't put all your chips on just one energy source. So I will, and that's my metaphor to close. We as a globe, as nations, as businesses, as people, we're betting on climate solutions. Some of them are going to come through, some of them might not, but we want to spread our chips on a broad portfolio that keep the lights on. So I'll stop there, and I think we have about 20 minutes or so for questions.
Thank you. I was wondering if you know what type of nuclear reactors most of them are going forward to building. Because I think like in the 80s, a lot of them are not like as efficient as they are today. And there's ones like thorium, which are substitutes, and that the the waste product is much more we're able to dispose of it better. So do you know like if they're choosing newer technologies like that to use?
Mm-hmm. Right. It's a mixed bag, what's happening right now. Several countries are building conventional light water reactors at a size of about 1,000 megawatts or more. And that's what South Korea is doing and China's doing largely. At the same time, various countries are experimenting with different designs. GE Hitachi is building a 300 megawatt reactor that's just kind of a downsized version of that larger reactor. Others are going smaller into what's called small modular reactors that have certain design features that might make them operationally more safe, and in some cases using fuel cycles that reduce the waste problem. So there's a sort of a spectrum of things going on right now, some fully commercial, some are at sort of the first demo stage.
You had discussed a little bit about carbon capture. Would you be able to talk about like sequestration, like putting it back into the ground and potentially companies using that to get more actual oil or other resources out of the ground as well?
Sure. It's one interesting aspect of carbon capture is that the oil and gas companies have been doing it for decades to just squeeze more oil out of depleted reservoirs, having nothing to do with climate. But it's interesting that they have, in a sense, inadvertently demonstrated something that we could do. We do know how to transport carbon dioxide by pipeline to an injection site. We know how to inject it into a geologic formation, and we know how to monitor it to make sure that it's not escaping. So there is, when we talk about carbon capture and storage as a mitigation option, it's not about producing more oil, but instead taking the emissions of a power plant or industry, and instead of venting them to the atmosphere, collecting them and putting them in a safe geologic formation underground. We have one way in the back too, for just to make sure you see it. Yeah.
With the expansion of renewables in the United States, with a lot of like the generating potential being in the Midwest and like non-populated areas, how do you foresee the grid changing in order to meet those demands, and also like with bidirectionality with the increase of microgrids as well?
Mm-hmm. The expansion of renewables in the US has been an interesting phenomenon to watch. There, at one level, you can, particularly solar, you can put anywhere. And so we have stuff going on in the Northeast and the Southeast and Midwest, West. But as your question implied, there are places where the production is much richer, and that is particularly in desert Southwest areas. Once you move away from that, the efficiency and the production of your solar plants tends to decline. So ideally, we should be able to build transmission to those richer areas. Similarly with wind, there's a vast swath of the Great Plains and the Midwest where the wind resource is the richest and where we've seen some of the most construction. And often we have not had the transmission lines then to transport that to the cities and the demand centers. Similarly with offshore wind, very rich when you get a couple miles out. How is it going to evolve? It's you put your finger on a very interesting question. Right now, there are there are several initiatives and ideas before Congress to try to streamline and ease the construction of transmission lines. But it's turning out to be contentious. Not everyone wants to have a transmission line running in or near their property. And it's probably a whole another lecture how to solve the transmission problem. But this is also popping up in other countries as well. The rich solar and wind resources are not always near load centers. How do you build the transmission to get it there?
Hi, would you say that the decision to like implement or initiate like electricity switches or alternative fuel switching in general, is it all influenced by like a community socioeconomic status or like even family income within that community?
Switching the source of electricity, I'm not absolutely sure of your question. An individual household choice, between a gasoline car and electric car is certainly going to be influenced by their income. But I'm not, can can you sharpen your question a little bit?
Yeah, so like for example, like with public transportation, I know that there are like cities where certain like bus lines are all electric buses and like more like public projects. Would my question was basically, would you say that a community's like overall socioeconomic status plays a role into whether or not like electricity companies will make more of an effort or less of an effort to expand their business or to initiate alternative fuel projects in an area?
Mhm. It is probably a factor, and I think we can step back and say that socioeconomic status and political power of pockets of neighborhoods within a city, for better or worse, have always influenced sort of the public services they get. And that is, you know, an unfortunate, you know, aspect of our society. I think particularly the Biden administration is trying very hard to make sure the new infrastructure funded by the infrastructure bill and by the Inflation Reduction Act has a very equitable component to, you know, what good new clean energy is brought to different areas. Beyond that, I think it's hard to generalize, but it's a good question.
My question, earlier in the presentation, you had said that climate change was a multi-country problem, but I understand that there's a lot of policies and agreements put in place, like the Paris Agreement, between many countries. But my question is, do you think countries are working more together to solve the problem, or each trying to outcompete each other in how fast and how like well they can reach net zero carbon emissions? Or do you think like more of them are working together, like, oh, this country found this solution, let's implement this and make it better? Or is it like more of a competition, I guess, is my question.
Yeah. No simple answer to that question. We have had a climate treaty since 1992, and nearly all the countries in the world have joined it. But that treaty, like so many treaties, you know, we do not have a world government. We do not have, you know, enforcement mechanisms that say, you know, this country shall do this. It's still kind of a floating crap game, and struggles particularly among the larger, more powerful countries. There were several attempts to collaborate more on solving the problem. You may have read about something called the Kyoto Protocol that was negotiated just 5 years after the treaty was first founded in '92. And for a while, countries thought, okay, this is going to be a way that all countries, or most countries, work together. Turns out the Kyoto Protocol never gelled enough to be a solution to the problem. But every year, the nations gather, have a conference of the parties. You probably heard about COP number 28 that happened in November. A turning point in most people's mind was the Conference of the Parties in 2015, where the countries agreed to something called the Paris Agreement, and countries agreed that they would each sort of set a target that they could meet given their circumstances and their resources, promises of some aid from the richer countries to the poor countries. I think we are seeing some progress on that post 2015, but it remains a very difficult, like any international agreement, it is sovereign countries agreeing. They also, sort of separate from the treaty, it's plain that some countries are competing to be the providers and exporters of the technology that will solve this issue. You know, who's going to be the big maker of electric vehicles? Who's going to be the big maker of wind, of solar panels, of nuclear power plants, et cetera? And so there is jockeying of position. There is, when the US passed a big set of incentives and particularly tax credits in 2022 under the Inflation Reduction Act, that spurred a bunch of other countries to say, whoa, wait a minute. The US is really trying to jumpstart some of these new industries, and it spurred some other countries to do similar packages of tax incentives. So that will continue. Again, a murky, a complex area.
Hi. So you had talked about like land accessibility, dry periods, and like hostile waste impacting the 30% of like energy coming from hydropower, nuclear, geothermal. I was wondering, bringing back your lecture to like the focus of the grid, how is improving the grid be like happening now in terms of like utilizing better storage solutions?
Mhm. There has been a exponential growth in the installation of batteries, lithium-ion batteries, across many areas of the grid. I think I recently read that now more than half of new solar plants going in have storage built in with it. That's a change from 4 or 5 years ago. This is all good, but the duration of those batteries, again, 2, 4, 6 hours, it helps, but it doesn't solve that intermittency problem. And what those 2, 4, 6 hour batteries can do, minute by minute, they can be a source to stabilize that supply and demand. They can also help us get into the evening hours where you store abundant solar during the day, and then 5, 6 o'clock, people come home from work, sun goes down, electricity demand goes up. Those 2, 4, 6 hour batteries are very helpful in keeping the lights on and keeping reliable supplies during those evening hours, but they don't take you through the entire night.
Hi, I just kind of had a question on about your like offshore winds and like everything like that. I know it's like a big problem in some communities where a lot of like the community members are like, I don't want offshore winds or like solar power, like those type of plants in our like town because it'll take away like the natural beauty and everything like that. So I was just kind of like wondering like your opinion on, do you think that like solar and offshore wind farm stuff like that will become like more like, do you think that the like not in my backyard thing will still be a problem as climate change gets worse? Or I just kind of wanted to get your opinion on stuff like that.
Yeah, you're using one of the most important, a very key phrase in the climate debate, not in my backyard, sometimes pronounced NIMBY. And it's a sad but true phenomenon that sometimes even people who want to solve climate change say, great, but just, I don't want that. I don't want to see that windmill from my beach house. I don't want a giant solar farm near my working farm in Indiana, something like that. I don't want to see windmills on that beautiful ridge in Vermont, something like that. And sometimes I don't even want that transmission line cutting through this forest. It is a real problem, and I don't think it's going to go away, but rather we need more as a society to agree. We need to build stuff. We need to and we need to build fast. And we're going to need to accept the fact that there is clean energy infrastructure and typically the impacts are visual. They're not pouring out smoke and soot and sulfur dioxide. That's going to be sort of a cultural change that will have to happen. If it doesn't happen, this process is going to go excruciatingly slow.
Last question.
You talked about the way in which mitigation is not going to be enough and we're going to have to adapt through, for example, carbon capture, which is a technological approach. But what is your opinion on other more natural approaches such as regenerative agriculture that has the potential to change one of the most polluting industries, agriculture, into carbon sequestration depot and also something that can heal biodiversity, lands, and improve nutritional value?
Yeah, very important question. Just in terms of sort of labels, the adaptation and resilience is, a set of actions to help us cope with climate change. Carbon dioxide removal is, I put more still in the mitigation bucket. We're trying to slow or reverse the warming. So what you've identified is there are two forms of carbon dioxide removal, broadly speaking. One is natural removal, and that's tree planting, forest health, and regenerative agriculture, which can result in more more carbon being stored in soil. Those natural means not only help on carbon dioxide, but also have other side benefits in terms of biodiversity, soil health, et cetera. We should be doing that as much as possible, but most experts and models would point to the idea that it won't be enough. We will need to supplement it with technological carbon dioxide removal, which could mean everything from literally pulling running air through, again, small chemical factories, stripping the CO2 out, or enhanced mineralization, working with certain rocks, pelletized or ground up, that absorb CO2 and mineralize it. We'll probably need both. And one reason in particular that's so frightening to me is we want to store a lot of carbon in trees. We want to plant more trees. At the same time, the climate's changing. We're seeing a lot of our forests going up in smoke. So that's another reason why we need to so get on top of this problem, and why we need both natural CDR and technological CDR in the years ahead.